Good evening. My name is Sue O. I'm the Senior Vice President of Education, Exhibitions, and Community Engagement for the Natural History Museums of Los Angeles County. I want to thank you for joining us, and we hope you are staying home safe and healthy. And on behalf of our museum, I wanted to share our commitment to be a true partner in building a better community where there is no tolerance for injustice or racism, where everyone is seen, heard, represented, and respected. This commitment builds upon our strong foundation to listen, work closely with our community partners, reflecting their perspective with new programming and approaches which embrace principles of social justice and promote equity and inclusion. So welcome to tonight's First Fridays Connected, the online version of First Fridays, and the final installment of our 2020 season. We hope you were able to join previous sessions featuring music and dynamic discussions designed both to be thought-provoking and inspiring. We definitely want to give a big thanks to our special presenting sponsors, X Prize, and our media and event sponsors, KCRW, Bank of America, and Spaceland Presents. But tonight, our discussion with the panelists will be on the subject on the future of food. All evening, First Fridays Connects will be right here on Zoom and then later on the YouTube channel. So after this discussion at 7 p.m., there is DINO 101 with Dustin Growick and NHM's Allison Bell. 8 p.m. to 9 p.m., we have KCRW DJ Novana Carmel, and she will help wrap up our season with a wonderful dance session on the NHM YouTube channel. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening. This is a woman who has worn many hats in the media and communications world, a longtime Los Angeles Times journalist and author and Emmy award-winning radio and television host. Let's give a big warm welcome to Ms. Pat Morrison. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you to the birds singing at your house in the background. It's lovely to hear them. And of course, the idea of birdsong and the Natural History Museum just go hand in hand together. So welcome everybody to the last First Fridays of 2020. And what a long, strange trip it has been. Tonight, with the future of food, we think about it in maybe a different way than we did 4 months ago. And if you're planning dinner afterwards, this is going to give you more than ample food for discussion and for thought. So for most of us in these parts, the concept of food used to be a matter of the luxury of choice. We're going to eat at home, we're going to eat out, we buy what we wanted when we wanted it. And then we saw empty shelves and we began to wonder about the food supply chain, and it scared us. So there are personal implications and global implications to the future of the food, and also to some of the creativity that you're going to hear about tonight is being brought to bear on making a technological loaves and fishes miracle when it comes to feeding this planet. So a lot of it begins with understanding the food supply chain, which some of us don't. A friend of mine who was in Washington in the late 70s was covering the farm protests as farmers converged on Washington, D.C., and blocked traffic with their farm equipment by way of protest. And my friend, the reporter, saw an angry woman get out of her car. Her car was stuck in traffic, and she started yelling at the farmers, "I don't need you farmers. I get my food at the grocery store." So we've got a lot of learning to do about our food and its future, and our guests are going to be helping us do just that. First, Ellen Jorgensen is a co-founder and chief science officer at Anika, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, a biotech startup that safeguards supply chains and promotes sustainable practices by using microbes to track and trace food and other products. 3 years ago, Fast Company magazine named her one of their most creative leaders in business. She's a promoter of science literacy, and her TED Talks, Biohacking, You Can Do It Too, and What You Need to Know About CRISPR, each has over 1 million views. Thank you, Ellen.
I'm very happy to be here.
And Caroline Colta is a project manager at the X Prize Foundation, working on designing incentivized competitions to make innovation and technology make a difference in international development and social impact. She also supports the foundation's research to chart future roadmaps for food systems. Before then, she worked in international development in the Mideast and North Africa for 10 years, advancing human rights and freedoms and empowering marginalized populations. Thank you too, Caroline.
Thanks, Pat. Happy to be here.
So I'd like to ask each of you, and maybe start with Carlene, the impact, as we've seen recently, that COVID has done to expose what's going on with our food supply and our food supply chain, where it's worked and where it's let us down.
Great, thanks, Pat. I think one of the things everyone is thinking about has been the impact of COVID-19 on everything we're seeing, and especially food. And food especially is very obvious to us. We see it everywhere we go. And the impact, as you said earlier in the introduction, is seen in food shortages. We see food waste as becoming more of an issue now, with shortages and surpluses that are difficult to understand. The one thing I want to kind of bring to the conversation too is not just the impact on COVID-19 of COVID-19 on food, but the other way around. How did we end up here, and did food play a role in us being in this situation right now with this pandemic? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. Our food systems have been one of the contributors to pandemics, and over the past few decades, we've seen spikes in pandemics more so than earlier in history. And that is not a coincidence. That these spikes are very linked to food systems practices that we're seeing to increase efficiency, to increase supply and yield, but they also have unintended consequences. And that impact on our health and the planet's health is one of those. And I want to specifically talk about two practices that we see in food systems that contribute to the situation we're in now with COVID-19. One is poor livestock management. The reason COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease. It's a disease that started in animals and then migrated to humans. And the way we treat animals and the way we manage animal species in our food systems contributes to that. For example, 70% of the chickens raised all over the world are raised in very intensive farming systems. We cut the lifespan of a chicken in half. We make it grow much faster than it should in a natural setting. And that creates problems in the value chain and in the health of the chicken itself that we end up consuming. Another issue with livestock management is excessive antibiotic use. There's a very, very unsettling statistic that 73% of all antimicrobes produced in the world end up to feed animals to help their growth promotion. And that's staggering that all of this antibiotics end up in animals and then in humans as they consume them. And one other thing I also want to mention on this is deforestation, the way we treat our forests to promote food growth. So when we cut down major forests to replace them with monocrops and huge spans of land that are just used for agriculture, it really impacts our health. And the relationship between deforestation and human health is difficult to understand, but one example is the Nipah virus, which kills up to 75% of those infected. This was a virus that originated in fruit bats who lived in their own habitat in Indonesian rainforests. And when food practices came in and food systems came in, cut down these forests, these fruit bats had to find somewhere else to go. And they went to Malaysia and then ended up in Malaysian orchids.
And they took their virus with them.
Exactly. In their new home, they started sharing food with farmed pigs in the area and took their viruses to the farmed pigs and then ended up infecting the farmers that farmed those pigs. So it really is a very connected thing. It takes a few steps, but it ends up hurting us as humans.
And Ellen, for you, what has, as we've pulled the rug back on food supply and food practices through COVID, what have you seen that's been exposed that does work, that doesn't work? And should we be alarmed about this?
Well, one of the things is it's very difficult sometimes to see the, as Caroline was saying, sort of the whole journey of your food. And a lot of people, as you said, Pat, think chocolate milk comes from brown cows, things like that. If you're grown, if you're raised in an urban area, if you don't have any contact, and of course, more and more of us are growing up in urban areas as cities expand and as farmland contracts, you get less and less connected to your food. And so we're seeing now all of the gaps in the supply chain. We're seeing the vulnerability of it. I'm struck by the fact that you see these massive piles of, say, zucchini rotting in a field because the supply chain that they were using is selling those through very specific vendors to restaurants, and they don't have the connections or the infrastructure to begin to sell them quickly to supermarkets.
So if the restaurants are closed as they were, there was
Right.
there was no other way. Was it just logistics that we couldn't?
It was a logistics problem. That was what was crazy about it is, you know, you want to get food from point A to point B where it's needed. And if the system is so fragile and so siloed that it can't be like the internet and reroute itself if something happens to one part. The same thing with the meat supply. It's
really
astonishing.
disgraceful. I mean, the bloodshed,
Astonishing.
killing of tens of thousands of pigs because what they couldn't get them to restaurants fast enough.
Well, it's such, if you're producing, as Caroline said, this mass production of food, everything has to be, it's like an orchestrated dance. The pigs stay with that particular farmer only for a few weeks because his job is to get them from weight A to weight B, and then he has to hand them off and accept more pigs. And if anything falls apart in that system, if he can't hand it off, and it's like an assembly line where one person suddenly drops out, and it becomes like the old Lucille Ball on the Chocolate Factory where she's stuffing the chocolates down her shirt because she can't wrap them fast enough. So supply chains can be very vulnerable. And they also, at Annika, we're concerned with transparency. So for example, the deforestation, palm oil is one of the worst products in terms of its impact on the environment. The deforestation that goes on in order to have the palm groves that create the palm oil has destroyed habitats for the orangutan, for example. And so if the consumer wants to support more sustainable palm oil, they have to know which producers are producing it that way. And that means going to the farmers. And a lot of these things are produced in countries where the logistics are even worse than the United States. They're super difficult. It's very hard to label things, to track them. And that's why we use these probiotic microbes to do our track and tracing that can be added into the food. So in a weird sense, we're sort of going back to biology and back to basics in order to kind of solve some of the issues that have been created by these systems.
So Caroline, from you and I talked about earlier that the Emperor Napoleon gave a prize for people who could preserve food because he knew the army travels on its stomach, and the longer it could eat, the farther it could travel. But have we sort of over-specialized ourselves with some of these supply chains and built in no flexibility? And is this a lesson that we can learn and really adapt, or are we just stuck in our ways because we're so sophisticated and so siloed, as Ellen said?
So XPRIZE never gives up. So the thing about XPRIZE, we're always optimistic for a better future, and we always try to see where technology can come in to enable these futures. And one of the things we do in our exploration of future of food is try to imagine a better future in which people are more connected, to Ellen's point, where supply chains are more resilient, and where it's more in the urban. We all grew up in cities, and in cities like LA, where you're very disconnected from the food that you're eating. So we've unpacked 12 breakthrough areas where breakthroughs through technology and other ways can help us achieve a better future for food. And when we think about food, it's not just the consumer on the consumer end, but we're also thinking of producers and food processors along the value chain. We're thinking of the environment as well. And we're thinking of all the people that are in developing countries and suffering from food insecurity and hunger. And we try to think of all of these different stakeholders as we imagine breakthrough areas and imagine better futures.
Well, I'm going to ask Ellen about the uses of the internet to take off on Caroline's point here about what the internet has been able to do and what potential you see it having is making us faster, nimbler, more responsive to need, as well as just answering the day-to-day demand that we've set up for ourselves.
Well, the internet for me was an analogy, and I can't pretend to be an expert in cyberspace. I deal more with flesh and blood organisms, but it is really to me, and I don't know sort of where your audience lies along this. Some of this technology, I think, is going to be inevitable, and even though there is a lot of resistance to it, I'm thinking, of course, of genetically modified foods, and that some people don't think they're quote unquote natural. On the other hand, you have situations like the banana blight that's happening right now in Africa and South America, and it's decimating major food crops for people. And people could literally starve to death, and yet there are solutions that aren't coming from outside. They're not coming from the West. A lot of times they're coming from research institutes within that country. And yet we've been, in a lot of ways, brainwashed that anything that has to do with genetic engineering is bad. And it's interesting, if you've heard of the rainbow papaya, the papaya industry in Hawaii is really huge. And there's a lot of resistance to GMO. And so when they passed anti-GMO regulation, they had to actually put in an exception for the papaya, because the choice was take these genetically modified papayas, and they're only modified very, very, I mean, we're able to go in like a scalpel now and modify only the thing that we need to change to make it virus resistant. And it always makes me laugh, because in the old days, if you wanted a new variety, you just planted your seeds around a source of mutation, like radiation.
And they'd all cross-pollinate, and you'd get something near.
Well, no, it's not even cross-pollination. It's mutation. It's speeded up mutation, and it's random. And they would find something like ruby red grapefruit is a perfect example. It came from being mutated by either a carcinogen or something. And then they were like, oh, well, this is a nice variety, let's sell it. And this was way before we knew anything about genomics or what the actual letter sequence was. So it was like a complete black box, and yet people accept that. But when somebody goes in with the technology that we're able to do today, which is a much more predictable and much more
Direct,
rational change, there's resistance. So I think we have to include some of that technology in the solutions.
and to use microbes for the same purpose. I think you were talking about producing nitrogen in the soil naturally instead of having to keep plugging fertilizer into it over and over again. Is that on the horizon for food?
That's definitely on the horizon, and there's several companies working on it. Our company at the moment is not working on that particular problem, but there are people in both academia and industry that really want to get rid of the use of nitrogen-based fertilizers. And whether it's through somehow, quote unquote, waking up genes that were dormant that used to do this, or providing companion microbes that have been engineered to help cereal crops produce nitrogen. One way or another, there's a lot of intellect being brought to bear on that, and I think we'll solve that at some point fairly soon.
Does that mean that the soil is less likely to be exhausted, and therefore?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, that's the nice thing about living things, is that they endlessly reproduce and they endlessly produce.
Caroline, one thing we haven't talked about, and I'm sure X Prize is looking at, because our focus has been so much on COVID these last months, is the impact of climate change too, because I joke that I'm going to retire and grow pineapples in Vermont. But when we see 100-degree temperatures inside the Arctic Circle this summer, that has to factor into how we're looking at the food we can grow, where we can grow it, and how much we can grow.
Right. And we have been exploring a lot of ways to maximize what we can get out of the resources that we have. And a lot of times, to Ellen's point again, like these things happen in nature. And when we suggest that they happen through technology or innovation, a lot of resistance kind of occurs. But one of the things we're exploring for maximizing yield from the land that we have and from the limited resources that we're faced with due to climate change is revolutionizing how we use the land and going back to kind of regenerative agriculture and thinking of how can we leverage technology to expand that kind of nostalgia for regen ag and make it more intentional and more kind of expanded to different food producers all over. So, and regenerative agriculture, to anyone who doesn't know, is just the very basic of balancing soil health, human health, and financial profit out of the land that you have. So instead of kind of cutting down and growing the same food over and over again over the same piece of land, it's more of an integration of different types of plants and vegetables and fruits that you're producing, and incorporating livestock in the mix. So it's not as intensified and focused, but it's more diverse, and that helps as well with the biodiversity of the soil and of the entire farm. So instead of in the future looking at the same, if you think of it, if you're in an airplane and you're looking down, farmland looks exactly the same. It's stretches of kind of copies and clones of the same pieces of land. And what we're trying to kind of promote through our work is a different view. It's each farm becomes its own kind of little island, and it helps its ecosystem on the farm itself.
And the question I'll ask Ellen in a minute, but Caroline right now is, how has the quantity and quality of arable land changed over the years? Because Caroline, you talked about deforestation. We've taken out forests so we can grow more food. But that comes around and bites us on the butt because we've taken out the forests. And then you add climate change on top of it. And it seems like we're playing a shell game with ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that stems mostly from missing the unintended consequences when we're thinking of an innovation. And that's what we also try to think of at X Prize. The idea of the green revolution was great in the moment, but we didn't think ahead. We didn't think 50 years from now, 100 years from now, what that means for the land and what it means for our sustainability over time. And that's, I think, a lot of those techno-optimist organizations are trying to shift away from that and thinking really of the unintended consequences. So when we design a competition, we don't just design to get to the technology, we design to in terms of thinking of what happens after the technology is adopted at wide scale, at mass scale.
And Ellen, of course, when at the beginning of the 19th century and the end of the 18th century, the whole point of the United States was going west and essentially shaving off the continent. You cut stuff down and plowed stuff up as you moved. How has our relationship with arable land, destructive consequences, and climate change maybe altered our attitude toward this? Or maybe we're still living in the 19th century when we think about that.
I think in a lot of ways we're still living there. I think that the next generation, you see all of these marvelous teenagers who are becoming so well informed and so politically active in areas like this. But I think most of us are still living in a land where everything just appears in the supermarket. We've become so detached from our food. And people can argue, well, everyone should have a garden, but it's very difficult. There are some reasons why cities exist. There are some very good reasons for people to live like that and be more efficient. And yes, we can make better cities, There are all sorts of people that are doing very interesting urban planning and incorporating more green stuff. But the idea that we're all going to have a garden in our window that's going to feed us, it just isn't practical. So there has to be some other solutions that blend kind of this more realistic view of the relationship between us and the land, that we're not a conqueror. We're not going out there and, that sort of idea that all the resources on Earth were created for us and that they're for us to use up. That might have worked when the population was much, much smaller than it is today. And it seemed like there would never be an end to the buffalo. There would never be an end to passenger pigeon pie for dinner. There would never be an end to fisheries, major fisheries in the ocean. And yet now we're seeing, between the massive overhunting, overfishing, not thinking ahead, we're not good as a race. I think the human race is not very good at looking 100 years into the future and planning for what's going to happen. But we're seeing all these things come to pass. We're seeing fisheries dry up and land overused and everything else. We're being forced to confront it, just the way COVID-19 is forcing us to confront a lot of other stuff about ourselves.
So let me ask Ellen and then take the question to Caroline. Are we going to be willing to change our expectations? For example, I won't be able to walk into a supermarket and buy nectarines from Chile in January anymore, that we live more seasonally and maybe with more modest quantity than we do now.
Well, the problem is it's just going to happen at some point, I think. I mean, if you want to talk about expectations, the expectation that you're going to find your favorite brand of toilet paper on the shelves was shattered a long time ago. And people are fighting over the sandpaper industrial toilet paper at the moment. So the expectations have definitely changed. And our view of that sandpaper toilet paper has become a lot more rosy. So I think that there has to be an attitude change. There will be. But of course, if we can somehow do that in a way that's less enforcing and more participatory with everyone, I think
like
that yeah. And maybe Caroline has more answers on that front.
Well, and we'll go to Caroline, because I think it's important to get a sense of whether people are going to be pushed or whether they're going to decide to go along with this themselves, about living with some limitations, and the sense that technology is there as a deus ex machina. It's going to get us out of all of our problems and things will go back just the way they were. Is that realistic? Is X Prize even trying to moderate expectations as you do your work?
Yeah, human behavior is the most difficult thing to change, and I think anyone who works with technology understands that if it is not adopted by humans, it's not going to go anywhere. But the flip side of this is, who would have thought 50 years ago that we will all be on our Zoom calls right now, sitting at home, connecting all over the world. And it's scary. Something like that, if I was living 100 years ago and someone told me you could talk to someone living in another country on a screen, I would not have believed them. But it's happening now and it's normal. And I think that kind of brings us to the whole conversation that the world is having now about the new normal. And I think people are open to it, and with some nudge, with some access to technology and information, to Ellen's point earlier, people need to get information more than anything and understand what their impact has been on the earth and on food. And we at X Prize, we think always, how can we give people an actionable experience that they can take and work with, instead of just putting them in front of a technology or expecting them to react a certain way to a technology.
Mm-hmm. And Caroline, you told me something which I thought was very exciting, because we think of sci-fi movies or space movies where the astronauts push a button like it's on a food vending machine. Like, I'd like something that tastes like lobster thermidor tonight and a glass of Pinot Grigio. And out comes a little cube that tastes just like lobster thermidor and a drink that tastes like Pinot Grigio. There are things like that in the works, really?
Right, that's very true. And that's what we do at XPRIZE as well. We look at these little signals, and that's what future foresight, like, we don't predict the future. We just look at those little signals happening all over the world and see how people are reacting to them. So to your question, one company in Japan we discovered through our research is working on a paste that mimics the 5 flavors, so sweet, sour, savory, umami. And it's as simple as you put that paste on your tongue, and then you get the flavors of food without consuming anything at all. And of course, it's still under research and it's not yet on the market, but these are the types of technologies and inventions that we look at when we think about our prizes, because we want to push the limits there. We want to see what people are up to and try to expand that and support that.
So Ellen, that sounds like a terrific idea, but look at these immensely massive and complex food supply chains we've created for ourselves. And you think they're going to let a taste paste come on the market instead of the
I don't know. When she was talking, do you remember Tang? When I was growing up, Tang was the astronaut's drink, and we all had to have Tang for breakfast instead of orange juice. And that didn't last all that long. It was kind of a fad. And so I think there's a lot of trial and error. I think that certainly it's justifiable to have a very positive attitude that this sort of thing is going to change the world. But we also have to realize there may be a lot of trial and error involved. One of the biggest things that happened early on in trying to produce genetically modified crops that were more nutritious was a variety of rice called golden rice. And one of the things that kind of killed the whole project, besides a very heavy anti-GMO lobby against it, was they failed to take into account the cultural differences. And they were trying to get the rice into certain countries where the preference was for rice that had no color. And if it had color, it was seen as either contaminated or lower quality. And that cultural barrier, and I'm sure there are a million examples where the West has swooped in and tried to impose what they thought was going to be a problem solver, only to find that they had completely ignored something that was going to mess up the adoption of it. But you just have to keep trying, and you have to keep learning from those early attempts. And if the problem is pressing enough, it's going to have to get solved, and you're just going to have to get through it.
And another thing, Ellen, is that certainly in this country, where in some circles there's a premium put on organic, and organic means it takes more time to produce, it's more expensive to produce, it costs more to buy. Are we recalibrating that? Are people's preferences going to be quantity versus quality? You can't grow organic for the whole world, can you?
I think, no, but I think that it's got to be, the organic, not organic is a very black and white explanation for something that really is much more nuanced. And I think what's going to happen is eventually people are going to realize that it's more nuanced. So you can say, I want to grow something organically without pesticides. But if you really look at what organic farmers are allowed to use, they are using pesticides. They're just a different type of pesticide. And it may be derived from naturally occurring bacteria or whatever. But there isn't a lot of evidence that it's better to apply it than it is to actually move that gene that produces that natural pesticide into the plant, which we've done. And yet there's tremendous resistance against plants with this gene in them. And the explanations for why it's bad, after all the testing that's been done and all the data that's been submitted to the FDA, and they found that it's perfectly fine for both people and the environment, eventually it's just going to get adopted. When electricity first came out, people were afraid it was leaking out of the sockets and they were terrified of it. And of course, we didn't know how to use it very well in the beginning, and people would get shocked every once in a while. But eventually now we just flip on a light switch and we don't even think twice about it. And I think there are certain technologies where that's going to happen. I also think that it's really important, for example, to save heirloom varieties of things and not have these massive monocrops, which cause some of the problems with diseases.
Like in the banana collapse that you're talking about now.
Yeah, I mean, there has to be a more nuanced solution. So just labeling something organic or non-organic, GMO or non-GMO, like I'm not really happy about the genetic modification that allows people to dump weed killer on the crops. So the Roundup Ready gene is not, I think, a good use of genetic engineering. But the BT gene, in which is that natural insecticide, I was at a conference once with a woman from South America who was saying, in my country, just watch the planes fly over and spray chemical pesticides over the crops, the villages, the children, the babies, and tell me that putting a natural insecticide gene into the plant isn't a better solution for us.
And so for Caroline, when we've talked about X Prize projects before here on First Fridays, it's been about what you're looking for, what you want to create an incentive for. So when it comes to food, what are the X Prize incentives and what are the goals?
Yeah, so in our future food impact roadmap, we set 3 kind of high level holistic goals for the future of food, our vision for the future of food. And then we've been since designing a couple of prizes so far to try to achieve those. And the first one is tackling food insecurity. That's a target for us, feeding people that don't have access to food right now. We have 800 million people all over the world that go hungry every day. They don't have food. 1.2 billion are food insecure, which means that their access to food is inconsistent over time. And 2 billion don't have the micronutrients that they need to survive. So, and that's an interesting kind of dichotomy there, because you can suffer from obesity, but still miss those micronutrients to live a healthy life. So understanding these food insecurity issues and then tackling them through competitions is one of our targets. Another one is expanding the economic opportunities for stakeholders along the value chain. I think, Ellen, your point about we think food appears in the supermarket or the grocery store, but we don't know the story behind it. We don't know that 1/3 of the people on this planet grow food for a living. That's their job, and they feed the entire population of this planet. And we look at those people as a kind of a target for us to make sure that the food system is inclusive of them, is allowing them to grow and find economic opportunities to live a good life. And lastly, the last one is the environment, the impact of food systems on our environment, on water access, on biodiversity loss, its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Those are the kinds of things that drive our work every day.
And as much as 40% of what Americans put on, and it's like throwing money away. It's throwing away the oil, the energy it took to produce that food. It's throwing away the labor. It's throwing away the sacrifice of the animal's life to throw it away. What is X Prize looking at, if anything, about food waste? And then I'm going to take the food waste question back to Ellen too.
Yeah, so food waste is a very complicated issue. We think of food waste, but we don't unpack it enough. And when we think about it at X Prize, we try to understand the underlying reasons why food waste happens. And it's divided into 2 types. One is food loss at the production end and distribution. So food that doesn't even make its way to the consumer for different reasons. And then once food gets to the consumer, it's then viewed as food waste. How do we tackle the excess, the leftovers that happen at the grocery store and at the consumer end, whether it's at a restaurant or a household. And we've explored different things. And one of them is, how do we extend food lifetimes? How do we make food last longer? How do we decipher these labels on food that people don't understand? I get a grocery store, a food item from the grocery stores, and I don't know what the best by date is or the use by date is. These things aren't intuitive to a lot of people. So how can we make these labels more understandable to a general public and things like that?
And I want to remind people, we'll take your questions in a minute. If you want to put them in the Q&A box in the Zoom chat, we will take your questions for our panelists. And Ellen, what about the food waste issue? Because as Caroline said, it's all along the way. You've got a system that understands that Americans don't like to buy bruised fruit or browned looking vegetables. And so those will get thrown away. So there's a loss right at the get-go.
Well, there's a tremendous amount of technology that is sort of coming down the road. It's not a mature technology yet. And we have a habit in general as people of hyping a technology and then getting upset when it doesn't happen, sort of within the hype phase, and then forgetting about it. And then it sort of quietly builds up and reaches its full potential when we're not looking. But there are things called biosensors that are relatively new technology, and it's programming microbes in some cases. In other cases, it might be the plant itself to signal us when stuff is going wrong. So for example, if a shipment has not been kept at the proper refrigeration and it's likely to go bad sooner, but it's invisible to the purchaser because, I don't know, the refrigerated truck broke down on the way and the driver just called another driver and they loaded it into the other truck. And meanwhile, the food has gone through a process that's going to shorten its shelf life. There may be ways to incorporate things that will give off a signal or detect that sort of stuff, and be incorporated at such a tiny amount within the food that it's practically undetectable unless you have some of this cutting edge technology that we have now. And I think there are things like that that are going to revolutionize the transparency of the food chain, which hopefully will lead to not being able to get away with some of the things that have caused food waste in the past. There's also the really intriguing, much more science fiction-y thing, more X-Prize-y, where the consumer themselves might be able to somehow query their own food. We've seen this at a low level with DNA barcoding, where the incident that hit the news was when two high school kids did a project in New York City where they went to sushi restaurants and they tested the fish. And what a DNA barcode will tell you is what species something is. And they found things were mislabeled in some restaurants almost 50% of the time. Now, whether that's the fault of the restaurant buying a cheaper cut of fish or getting sold a cheaper cut, and once the fish has been turned into fillets, sometimes it's very hard to distinguish what fish it was.
And it's also a way to protect endangered species too, if you find out they're being.
Oh, absolutely.
So
absolutely.
I want to get to some questions for both of you. So let's see what we have here. Well, Charla asked about food waste, and we already talked about that. She also says, historically speaking, many cultures did not take the land and animals for granted. There was always a give back in every part of the animal and the plant. And that becomes back, I think, to the culture that you were talking about, Caroline, that our ability to recognize cultural differences when it comes to food habits may not be as good as it should be.
Yes, and we've seen it. Ellen mentioned a couple of examples where something that works for one culture doesn't work for others. And we've seen it even in the alternative proteins market, this plant-based kind of alternatives that we have now, and even in the discussion around cultivated proteins that are grown in a lab. They need to work, they need to be versatile, and as of right now they aren't. And as we explore them further and as the technology develops further, they become much more versatile to respond to these different cultural preferences that are very important when it comes to food. Food is extremely cultural, and we forget that, and we detach that food from the culture that it goes in.
Michael asked us a question I think we already addressed, like the food replicators from Star Trek, and Carolina was telling us about a paste that's under development in Japan where it can replicate any particular case, which is just sort of ideal, I think. But a question from Sue and Steve about whether corn doesn't replace the nitrogen in the soil, the question of crop rotation, which used to be the way to let the soil replenish itself. Ellen, is that even done any longer? Is it not as efficient as we'd like to think?
I mean, I'm not a farmer, so I don't know. I know that in my home garden, I plow under a cover crop every year, and it does help replenish the soil. I don't know what, maybe Caroline, you know a little bit more about how you would do that, and whether or not a farmer, if a farmer chooses to do that, it means that there's one season that they can't grow the crop that's the money crop. Why do they use chemical fertilizers?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the discussion we had earlier about regenerative agriculture. The whole idea is to have these cover crops and different, like you have shrubs and you have your plants and fruits growing, and having this diversity on farm. And there are efforts to do it. It hasn't taken off yet to the extent that we would like to see in general as a planet. But there are some efforts to do it, and I can share with the person who asked that question some resources for up and coming startups and organizations that are trying to expand that work.
We'll see whether we can put some links on the Natural History Museum, the First Friday's website. Thank you for that. Elena wants to know, and I want to ask Ellen about this, your views on cell-based meats, Memphis meat, Franken meat, whatever names you want to apply to it.
Wow, Franken meat doesn't have any sort of baggage, does it? I will say I think it's a fascinating area. It's extremely difficult. If you ask the people that are working that area, they say that they are doing the very earliest proof of concept experiments, and they are not expecting to be practical mass producers of meat in a short period of time. They're pioneers, they're paving the way. They're trying to take barriers down one by one. They're getting overtaken, I have to say, though, by a very interesting hybrid between the sort of vegetarian view and genetic engineering, because the Impossible Burger has taken the heme protein from a plant. Plants have heme proteins too, but if you isolate it and you make a lot of it, and they're probably doing it through a genetically modified microbe, because that's how we do most of our production of molecules like that. And then they add it back to this plant-based burger, and it has the bloody taste of meat. And so it makes people who didn't want to eat vegetarian burgers because of the taste more likely to cross over to something like that. So I think that both approaches are really valid. Well, all approaches. I mean, number one, encouraging people to like eating vegetable-based diets better, not immediately indoctrinating everyone that they have to have meat or they're going to die, which is the way Americans seem to think. And then the second tier is maybe encouraging people to eat these plant-based but meaty tasting things that we're coming up with. And then the third tier is really getting that science to the point where it can produce a cruelty-free meat. I don't know when that'll be, but I
Carly,
know there's some very serious people working on it.
this question sort of plays off that, and this is a big idea question that is one that X Prize, I think, would fall in your wheelhouse, which is from Zach, who says, we eat partially with our eyes. So what are some ways we can design healthier, more sustainable foods to utilize our neurology to seem more appealing?
That is a great question. And when we were putting together this impact roadmap, we started thinking, exploring internally, like, let's brainstorm crazy ideas, right? Because that's what we do at X Prize, and we see which of them can come true. And there was actually some movement also with some brand new innovators to use VR, AR and VR, to create an experience for food. So you could be, there's, I think, a restaurant that has already implemented this, and I think also in Japan, where you enter into the restaurant and you put on a VR set, and it takes you on a journey of the food, and it gives you an entirely different experience than you would have at a different restaurant. And we even toyed with the idea internally a bit more and explored, can I one day be eating a lettuce, a salad or something, but in my mind, in my VR set, I'm eating a burger? And does that kind of impact my experience with the food that I'm eating?
Or to take you to wherever the food is being created, so you have an appreciation of the work, the time, the effort that went into it. And so when it comes time to order and eat it, you feel differently about it.
Exactly. Can the restaurant give you the story of food from farm to your table, like this journey that you take?
I like that. I like that better than the idea that you're eating one thing and thinking the other. I'm thinking, well, do I want to take the red pill or the blue pill here? Can I unplug?
Right.
Well, taste is one of our senses, and we hope that it doesn't get, reduced to a vestigial one. But at the same time, we need to be responsible. So I want to ask each of you, look into the future, look at a menu or a grocery list or our dinner plate 6 months ago, and then look ahead 6 years and think, how different is each of those maybe going to be? Ellen, do you want to start?
Well, I think we'll probably have more and more genetically modified varieties of food on plates. People aren't going to realize it necessarily, because I think they'll be replaced quietly with things that are disease resistant or insect resistant. People seem to think that genetic engineers sit around and say, well, how can we make a square tomato? How can we make something that ships better but tastes horrible? But a lot of people are trying to solve very real food shortage problems through this, and combat some very devastating things. So a lot of this is just going to creep more and more into the food supply. I think that what I've seen in my neighborhood personally is that garden stores have completely sold out of seeds and plants, and everybody's planting what we used to call victory gardens.
And we may again.
Yeah. So I think that there will be a lot more people that, if they don't decide to make their own food, I think they're going to have a little bit more respect for the people that do produce food when they find out how much work goes into trying to grow a head of broccoli or a bunch of carrots.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully they'll, you can only hope. You can look to the future and you hope that this is going to spark in the best of us more of an appreciation of how privileged we are to have a good food supply chain and how fragile it is, and have a better relationship to it. Maybe it's forced people to eat more local. Maybe it's forced people to join CSAs and get their vegetables from places other than the supermarkets that are having trouble keeping them on the shelves.
And Carlene?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm imagining a future, I don't necessarily want the food to be different, right? It should all be what human beings want to eat and desire to eat. I just hope that it's grown in a much more sustainable way, and that we know more about its journey, because it is a very long journey. And the more we know and the more information we have, the more empowered we are to make better choices. So if anything, it's that its story is better before it gets to our plate.
And Ellen, will this take some massive changes? Like a question from one of our attendees, if we could feed more people now, if we didn't devote so much food and water to cattle, to meat, I mean, can we change some of the equations with the resources we already have?
Well, that becomes, again, sort of a massive 10,000-foot question that actually is more Caroline's wheelhouse. I'm more boots on the ground trying to solve specific problems. Think of it as my company would be applying for the X Prize and Caroline would be setting out the problems that we're trying to solve. So,
okay, well, let's go to Caroline then, because it's a technological problem, but it's also a psychological problem.
Yeah, and we are seeing more shifts. We are seeing more commitments from food systems and food producers, large scale companies that are committing to better practices and committing to reducing the amount of water that goes into it and finding efficiencies in their processing plants. And we're also seeing a shift a little bit at XPRIZE through our research too, towards a more circular, modular system where it's smaller, it's more targeted, and it doesn't end up in waste. And that's something we're circular, at least, is something we're seeing a lot commitment towards.
Does that mean getting out of those silos that Ellen was talking about, that these mega agricultural systems have created for us?
Right. A circular system definitely calls for more stakeholder collaboration, because these systems feed into each other. So you can't talk about a food system without thinking of the water value chain and the water system, because you need water to create food. And the water that we consume, the waste that we produce, is also going to benefit soil and as a fertilizer, for example. So we are as an endless source of fertilizer for the food, for the growing food. And I think the more we see these systems connected and the more we eliminate waste from the value chains and the different value chains, the better we will be.
And Ellen, just a last quick question for you.
I had something that I really wanted to add to that. Can I jump in?
Sure.
Yeah, the one thing though, as you're talking, that I'm thinking about is quality control. And unfortunately, large conglomerations do quality control in some ways a lot better because they can have a quality standard across the whole company. At Annika, we would like to hold them to it by having this incorporated microbe that tracks and traces where things have been. And if they say it's coming from a farm with sustainable practices, we would be able to tell through the use of that. But if everyone is doing their own thing on their own sort of small farm, actually where a lot of the E. coli contamination comes from is from basically fecal-based fertilizer that ends up on the crop. And I worry a little bit that if you don't have some sort of overall standard, which I mean, big farms do a lot of bad things, but they do a lot of good things too. How are you going to maintain that standard when everything is its own little microsystem?
Yeah.
Well, as small farmers, the patchwork of small farmers always found that you would have those inconsistencies and you would take them to a small market. It's much harder when you have those, massive standards across massive food systems. Let me ask each of you as we conclude, start with Ellen and end with Caroline. Do you think that the COVID-19 crisis is, to use that phrase, creating an opportunity for us to amend our food systems, to fix what's broken and to improve what isn't?
Well, you can't fix it if you don't know it's broken. And I think, like a lot of things in our culture, it's really pulling the blanket off of it. The idea that, Americans panic because there might be a meat shortage because of the lack of workers in the processing plants that were under conditions that were allowing them to contract the virus faster than other people because they couldn't social distance, and the shutdown of those factories and the disruption of that chain and the other food chains, really, it was like shining a light in a dark corner. So that's the first step. Now someone has to come up with good ways to fix that. And we do our part at Annika, but obviously we don't have the whole answer. So Carolyn, how are we going to fix it?
I agree with you. I might not have an answer on how to fix it, but I definitely agree that it's shedding the light on a big problem with food systems, and several little problems as well that we are trying to address at XPRIZE. And it's funny that we had this impact roadmap even before COVID hit, but the whole situation now with COVID-19 kind of validates our findings and pushes us to take action much faster.
So we hope people will rethink when they shop and rethink when they cook, and just have another look at the food that sustains us, and have some respect and regard and really more knowledge for the process that gets it from our farms to our forks. So I want to thank both of you for being here. It's been so enlightening and so helpful. And I hope that when we convene next year for First Fridays, we will be doing it in person, and that our fabulous food trucks will be back, and you'll have a lot of information from tonight to take to those meals that you do. So thank you both for joining us, and I hope we'll be able to put some of your information on the First Friday site at the Natural History Museum. So that's not the end of tonight. You stay tuned for more First Friday connected programming here on Zoom and on the Natural History Museum YouTube channel. Who knew there was a YouTube channel? Don't go away. At 8 o'clock, KCRW DJ Novena Carmel will close out the night and the season at the DJ Lounge on the NHM YouTube channel. But before that, it's DINO 101, hosted by science communicator Dustin Growick and featuring the Natural History Museum's own Alyssa Bell. So take it away, Dustin. Rah, rah, rah.
Thanks, Pat. How's it going? Listen, last time I saw your hat and I loved it. Now I see your hat again. Still love it.
All right. I got to keep it up for you. If not for anybody else, it's all about you, Dustin.
Well, okay. Pat, if I ever meet you, I'm going to wear a special hat as well.
Please do.
Okay, I'll do what I can. So, hi guys, my name is Dustin Growick. Like Pat mentioned, I am a science communicator and a huge dinosaur nerd. We're gonna get DINO 101 started in just a moment with our very special guest from the Dinosaur Institute, Dr. Alyssa Bell. Before we do that, grab a drink. It's Friday night. We should have a drink in our hands, just much like I do. Also, I'd like to welcome my co-hostess with the mostest, the best middle school geologist science teacher I have ever met, Christina Gustovich. Hey, Christina, what are you drinking?
Hey, I am drinking a brand of boozy seltzer by whom I am not yet sponsored.
Okay, that's good. Alyssa, you made it. Hello. Again, with the amazing background, we have dinosaurs, pizza, and lasers in space. Hey, Alyssa, how's it going?
Good. How are you guys doing?
We're great. We've been hanging out. We've been drinking, getting ready to talk about dinosaurs, the greatest group of animals to have ever existed on this planet or anywhere in the universe, per your background, which is
absolutely.
So before we get into it, I want to mention this. So Christina, again, is a science teacher. She's also a trained geologist. I am a science communicator and museum consultant. Alyssa went to USC. She teaches at Caltech. She is a postdoc at the Dinosaur Institute at the Natural History Museum. But Alyssa, before we get into exactly who you are, what you study, the research at the Dino Institute, per normal Dino 101 operating procedure, you have to play everyone's favorite game, which is Dino or Not a Dino. Alyssa, the stakes are incredibly high right now. And by that, I mean, not really that high at all, but we're going to play a very fun game. Here's how this is going to work. And you guys listening, watching at home can play along as well. I'm going to read the name of 10 different animals to Alyssa. She has to determine if this animal is a dinosaur or is not a dinosaur. So some are real, actual dinosaurs, and some I've totally made up. There are no tricks in there, like I would say like mastodon, which is a real animal, but not a dinosaur. Nothing tricky like that. It's either absolutely a dinosaur or not a dinosaur. Alyssa, if you need a spelling, I'm more than happy to spell the dinos. I would say you can phone a friend for help, but I think that would take too long. So maybe Christina, if she's feeling amicable, could maybe help you out with one. And also, last thing, Alyssa, I want to let you know, there is a theme for the not dinosaur animals. And if you can discern that as well, you get super duper bonus points.
And I think our attendees can use the chat. So you can help us, you can help Alyssa out that way. If you hear the name that Dustin reads off and you're sure, you're like, yes, dino. Let us know in the chat. Same thing, definitely not a dino. Help us out.
Yeah, dino or not a dino. Alyssa, you ready to play?
Sure.
All right, let's dig in. Animal number 1, Protohadros. Protohadros. You can ask for spelling if you need it. You can look in the chat box.
Let me check the chat. No idea.
Trish says not a dino. Oh, Melissa disagrees. Says yes, dino.
Yeah, I don't know.
Alyssa, if you need to like verbally tell us what's going on in your thought process as you try to arrive on yes or no, feel free to let us in there. But what are your thoughts on Protohadros?
I've never heard of it, so I don't know. But I don't work on I work on birds, so I haven't heard of lots of different dinosaurs. So it could be, or it could not be.
There are over 600 different species. I don't think anyone on the planet knows all of
Actually,
them.
considering that birds are dinosaurs, there are over 10,000 species.
Facts.
So
Big facts. Big facts. It is true. So for Protohadros, are we going yes or no?
let's say no.
We're saying no, but yes, Protohadros is a dinosaur. That's okay. They should get easier. Number 2, Noxvenator. Have you ever heard of a dinosaur called Noxvenator?
I haven't heard of that one either.
You're going no. I see a def no.
And a yes.
And a yes. Oh, that's tough. Noxvenator. Yay or nay?
Let's go yes this time.
We're going yes. Noxvenator is not a dino. That is okay. We are 0 for 2. Again, no one has ever gotten all of these right. Number 3, Cedar pelta. Cedar pelta.
Cedar pelta?
Cedar pelta. Ooh, I
Sure.
see Melissa says yes. We got a yes from Melissa for Cedar pelta.
Okay, we'll go with yes.
We're going yes. That is a correct answer. Cedar pelta is a dinosaur. Back in the green. Love it. Next, Nashvinopteryx. Nashvinopteryx. Alyssa, the face you made reacting to that is a good indication of whether or not it's a real dinosaur. Nashvinopteryx.
I'm gonna go with no, but I mean it could be. They come up with some pretty weird names.
They do come up with some weird names. That is not one of them. That is not a dinosaur. You're back to 50-50. Here we go. Next, Medusa ceratops.
Medusa ceratops?
Medusa ceratops.
I haven't heard of that one, but it could be.
They all could be. Anyone in the chat? Let's see.
We have another Christina with a K who's very smart, who says yes. Jasmine says fake. Elena says too cool not to be. Melissa says yes.
That's 2 yeses and 1 no in the chat.
Sure, we'll go with yes.
We're going yes. Listen, the chat is helping out. Medusa ceratops is an actual real dinosaur. You're now 3 and 2, back in the green, crushing it. We have a couple guesses in the chat thus far of what the theme of these are. I don't want to spoil it. I'm just going to keep going. Memphimimus. Memphimimus.
No.
No, that is not a dinosaur. You are correct. 4 in a row. Rough start, but you're coming back. 4 and 2 thus far. Number, let's see, 5, 6, 7. Number 7, Amygdalodon.
Amygdalodon?
Yes. If you need a spelling, I'm happy to spell as well. Amygdalodon.
Let's go with yes.
We're going with yes. Yes, Amygdalodon is a dinosaur. 5 in a row, crushing it. Amygdalodon is a dino. You're 5 and 2. Next, Gatlinicus.
No.
I feel like Alyssa might have figured out what the theme is. Don't spoil it yet. That is correct. Gatlinicus is not a dinosaur. You're now 6 and 2. Next, Appalachiosaurus. Appalachiosaurus.
I'm just thinking about Appalachio.
Appalachio.
Uh,
Appalachiosaurus.
I haven't heard of that one. So I guess we'll go with no.
So a couple of things, Alyssa. First of all, you're incorrect. Appalachiosaurus is a dinosaur. Second of all, I hadn't heard of any of these either before I put this game together. So we are now 5 and 3. Our last 2. Oh, wait, no, wait. That's 5. That's 6 and 3. You're 6 and 3. This is our last one. Before I tell you it, do you have any idea of the theme of the not dinosaurs, which were Noxvenator, Nashvinopteryx, Memphimimus, Gatlinicus?
They're all cities in Tennessee.
They are cities in Tennessee. So let me know if you know the name, or I'm sorry, if you know if this last one is a real dinosaur or not. Proto-Chattanooga cephalosaurus.
That's totally a dinosaur. Everybody knows
That's
that one.
No. So Proto-Chattanooga cephalosaurus is not a dinosaur. After a rocky start, you got 7 out of 10, which is very good for a game that is very hard and has seen other paleontologists barely get 50%. So, Alyssa, that was obviously a fun, silly game, but you are an actual, real, legit dinosaur scientist. So my first question for anyone that is as big or even bigger of a dinosaur fan than I am, how did you personally get into dinosaurs? Well, like, what's your dino origin story?
So I was that stereotypical obnoxious 3-year-old that, you know, loved dinosaurs and told all their teachers they wanted to be a paleontologist, and I just never grew out of it. So here I am.
And here we are.
Yep.
Okay. I noticed in the chat a couple of people asked why Tennessee cities. You let me know earlier on our call that you're from Tennessee originally, even though you've spent more time now in LA, which I should mention, Christina, you guys are both from LA. That's going to come into play in a little bit. Now, my second question for you. So you do a lot of work at the Natural History Museum, at the Dinosaur Institute. But before we get to that, I was really interested to hear about how you work on the side with environmental law firms, because a lot of people don't recognize that paleontologists work in a lot of ways outside of just dinosaur research or just the museum. So what is the deal with that? How did that come about? And like, what is that?
Right. So in California, there are a number of very strong environmental protection laws that include all sorts of environmental parameters. So endangered species, waterways, and fossils actually are one of the things that are protected as well. So not just dinosaurs, but all sorts of fossil resources. And so paleontologists are employed by the environmental protection industry to make sure that fossils aren't damaged during construction projects and things like that. And so my job as an environmental mitigation paleontologist is to make sure that if someone wants to, you know, build a new mall or a new road or anything like that, that the proper sort of research is done in advance to make sure that they aren't going to run into fossils, and that if they might, that there's someone on hand who's trained in recognizing fossils to make sure that they're salvaged should they be encountered.
So when you were hired for a job like that, I'm curious, is it you know how to identify fossils, or is it you specialize in the age of the rock where that construction is happening, or is it more broad than that?
It's a little bit broader than that. So as a paleontologist, I oversee a number of projects. I work throughout California, as well as even more broadly, actually the entire Southwestern United States. And so it's my job to sort of do the background research, pretty much any age of rocks that might have fossils. So while my PhD and my research specialty is very, very narrow, I work on, fossil birds from the end part of the Mesozoic. In terms of mitigation paleontology, I've worked on everything, the entire span of the paleontological record almost by this point. I just came back from a field trip looking at ice age deposits. So it's not just a very focal sort of niche group. Instead, it's just doing the background research to determine if any type of fossil might be at risk.
I see.
And then making sure that the appropriate measures are taken to protect those fossils.
Very cool. Quick sidebar, you guys, if and when you have questions for Alyssa, please drop them in the chat, or you can send them directly to Christina if you want. We're going to do a big Q&A in a couple minutes after I get through my questions for Alyssa, because I'm interested, speaking of research, so you work at the Dinosaur Institute at the Natural History Museum. Can you tell us a little bit about your work at the Dinosaur Institute, and like, what are you guys focusing on now, whether it's a time period or a specific species? What are you guys working on now at the Dinosaur Institute?
We've got a bunch of different things going on right now. That's kind of the amazing thing about being at the DI, is we have such a huge, diverse paleo staff. I think last time, I think you were talking with Nate, who has been working in Antarctica on those fossils. And so, we have a huge diversity of research. My research in particular is on fossil birds. So I work on birds that lived the same time as sort of the end of the dinosaur era. And I work on the evolution of these birds. They're pretty interesting in that they're the first animals that we know of that sort of gave up the ability to fly and became fully aquatic instead. And so it's an interesting evolutionary story in that regard. So that's what my research focuses on. But just walking through the lab, well, before COVID and before we sort of had to put a pause on things, was always fascinating because you never knew what you were going to see. You know, you might see a huge sauropod femur that was being worked on, or you might see some ichthyosaur material, or you might see some of these Antarctica jackets being opened. I mean, there was always something, every day was something new and different, which is really exciting.
So speaking of sauropod jackets, I have some images that I'm about to open here, hopefully in a second, that you sent me of the research you guys are doing. Before I get to those, because I'm still trying to figure out how to share this. So I love the fact that you study, and let me make sure I pronounce this correctly, Hesper ornithiforms. Did I nail that?
Yep, nailed it.
So when I study and think about dinosaurs and talk to kids and do museum tours, I talk a lot about how birds are literally dinosaurs. They're not just descendants of dinosaurs. When taxonomists or paleontologists group certain species together, we looked at shared characteristics and all the diagnostic features that make a dinosaur, birds share those same ones. So when we say birds have gone extinct, when we say dinosaurs have gone extinct, we mean non-avian dinosaurs. All non-flying dinosaurs have gone extinct. And so the birds we see today, like you mentioned, which some would argue number of species exceed that of mammals, amphibians, and reptiles combined, which is bonkers. I mean, birds live on every continent. My question for you is, because you're studying some of the first birds that were aquatic, do we know anything about the feather evolution and the difference in the feathers in those type of birds versus birds that are in the sky? Because I know the feathers and like the structures and whether they're oils and what are very different in modern birds today that live in water versus fly in the sky.
Yeah, unfortunately, the birds that I work on, we haven't found any feathers yet.
Okay.
Hopefully, maybe someday we will. The rocks that they're preserved in, they have a global distribution. So we do have specimens from all over the world, but mostly they're known from Kansas. That's where sort of the richest deposits are. And those rocks aren't particularly good for preserving soft tissue. So it's not like the Chinese deposits that are very famous for having those just amazing feather preservation. We don't have any of that for these birds. But it would make sense, right, from an evolutionary standpoint, that they would have had some sort of modification to the feathers, given the degree of modification they had to the rest of their skeleton. So these birds were entirely flightless. Their forelimbs, their wings, were reduced to just little bitty nubs, tiny. They weren't flying anywhere. They weren't even flapping around. Like, these guys were pretty sad if they would have tried to move their wings around. And so it would make sense that they had interesting sorts of adaptations in their feathers as well. But unfortunately, we don't have any evidence of that at this time.
So this birds that you study, the Hesperornis, are they the antecedents to penguins, or is this a different lineage?
No. So these are pre-modern birds. They are not part of Neornithes, which is the name of the clade or the group that encompasses all modern birds. So they're more primitive than modern birds. And so some of those primitive features include things like teeth. So they still retain teeth in parts of their jaw, which is more of a traditional non-avian dinosaur sort of trait. And they had other traits like that as well that were more typically more primitive than we see in modern birds. In terms of their overall sort of skeletal morphology and their sort of like general appearance, they kind of would have been like an overgrown cormorant or a loon or a grebe, if you're familiar with those sorts of aquatic birds. So not like a penguin, but more of a foot-propelled diving bird, but with the elongate neck, not the sort of short, squatty neck that penguins have.
Okay, that makes sense. So a couple more questions, and then I know we have a ton of great questions in the chat. I'm reading some of these. These are really good. I know this is wild speculation, but Alyssa, what do you see as like the next big discovery or breakthrough or revolution in dinosaur science over the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Like the just the craziest idea out there that could happen kind of thing. Like,
I mean, what you see on the right, like a lot of people talk about how we haven't found direct evidence of feathers on T-Rex, but we know a ton of its smaller cousins had feathers. So it's a good chance that possibly you find a T-Rex with feathers. So like feathers on more theropods is one, but like other than that, or like, what do you see on the horizon?
I think there's been a lot of really, really interesting work done on a very small number of specimens in terms of the preservation of the potential preservation of molecular data, so of proteins and things like that. And so I am really interested to see where that research goes in the future. And I don't want people to think I'm talking about dinosaur DNA and Jurassic Park and cloning dinosaurs. I'm not talking about that. That's silly. That's not going to happen. But there have been some really interesting breakthroughs in terms of just very, very basic sort of proteins and things like that that might be telling an interesting story if those preservational stories are what they seem to be right now. And so I think that would be an interesting story to follow in the coming years.
So I'm going to actually share my screen now so people can see what a paleo art example of your study species might look like. So here's a couple right here, a couple different images of this. Whoa, where'd it go? It disappeared. That was weird. How'd that happen? Oh, I moved it by accident. Hold on one sec. There we go. So Alyssa,
they're beautiful.
Alyssa, you sent me this image. So who is this right here that we're looking at?
So the one that I'm seeing looks isn't the one that I sent you. The one that I'm seeing looks like a mallard duck, sort of. I don't know what that is.
On the left of the, do you see two?
Yeah, so the diving one is, the name of that genus is Fumicollis.
Okay.
And it is one of the smaller genera of Hesperornithiforms. So it is known from Kansas. And you can see those tiny little stubby wings there. So clearly not flying anywhere with those little wings. And so it is one of the more recently described genera of the family.
Cool. The one on the right I put there, this is Hesperornis, which I think is one of the more well-known of this group. At least this is one interpretation, one paleo art interpretation of Hesperornis. And actually, I was going to ask you, do we have any idea with respect to the colors, or is that totally speculative?
It's speculative. Yeah, we don't have any feather preservation at all.
Okay, cool. All right, we're about to go to Q&A from our panel, but first, I want to share a couple of these fieldwork pictures. So I think you sent me about 5 or 6. I want to go through these. You can just like narrate and tell us where this is, who these people are, what they're doing, because these are making me want to go and do field work right now. So first of all,
it's going to do the same thing. I miss the field so much.
So what are we looking at right here? Where is this?
So this is in Utah. This is actually very close to Bears Ears National Monument. This is our Natalie Quarry. Okay. We have been working our Natalie Quarry for over 10 years now. We've recovered hundreds of jackets of different types of dinosaurs, primarily sauropods. So lots of things like Camarasaurus have come out of this quarry, but also some things like Allosaurus. We've got some ankylosaur material. We've got some stegosaur material. So really, really exciting bone bed that we've been working for a very long time now. It's just an amazing site. And we actually do have some of this material already prepped and on display at the museum. So when we do open back up, if you get a chance to go, you'll get to see some of this material already on display. And also in our lab, you'll get to see people working on it in the sort of the fossil lab. You can walk by and watch people working.
So first you go here and then you find the stuff. And is this, so who is this right here? What's going on here?
So this is actually an older one. This is from about 2005. This was, that's me on the left, and then Luis Chiappe, the head of the Dinosaur Institute and the vice president of research and collections at the museum now. That is us excavating Thomas the T-Rex, who is, Thomas is now on display in our dinosaur hall as well. And so that's sort of part of the process of, I think in that picture, we're working on a jacket for some of Thomas's teeth maybe that were fairly small. So little bitty jackets.
Speaking of jackets, these are much bigger jackets.
Yes. So this is the Natalie Quarry again. So these are just a mix of some of the jumble of jackets that we pull out. This is from last summer. That's me on the left, and Stephanie Abramowicz, our artist and quarry mapper extraordinaire. She's the one who keeps track of all of these. And when you've got hundreds of jackets, that's a monumental task, and she does an amazing job. You can see the code there, 16U. We've gone through the alphabet 16 times with the number of jackets that we've collected. And so that's us trying to keep track of them all.
Speaking of a lot of jackets, you sent me pictures with a lot of jackets.
Yeah.
But let's step back because we had a question. What's a jacket?
Oh, so a jacket is, sometimes they're called a cast. A jacket is that white stuff that you see. That is plaster of Paris soaked into burlap that we, when it's wet, we wrap it around the fossils while they're still in the ground to protect them. And so then we can, move them around, carry them back to the museum without worrying so much about damaging the fossils inside. And then when we're back in the museum, we can open them in the lab in a sort of controlled setting to make sure that we can very carefully remove those fossils and clean them up and start the preparation and the conservation process.
Nice. One of my weirdest fieldwork experiences, it was the first time I ever did fieldwork. One of the women I was working with found a jacket from a previous season, like 5 or 6 years prior, that they found so late in the season. They covered the top with the jacket and then just covered it with dirt and then forgot about where it was. So she like discovered a time capsule of a time capsule, including the mat that the people, like, you put your knees on the mat so you're not hurting your knees as you're digging the whole day. So a mat and like a tool and an entire, like a giant jacket. We don't know what it was or where it was from, but she found it and they're going to bring it back to the museum, which is something you don't expect to find when you're looking for just a rock and a bone.
Yeah, we usually map ours when we have to leave them over the winter. We try not to forget about them.
Yeah. Cool. All right, Christina, I know we got some questions from the chat. I want to answer this one before we jump into it because I love this question. Elena asks, why are birds the only surviving dinosaurs? So I have an idea, and I actually would love to hear Alyssa let me know if I'm even remotely close to what she thinks. So I think birds are the only dinosaurs that survived the extinction that killed all non-avian dinosaurs 65 million years ago for 3 reasons. So first of all, birds are omnivores. So they're generally speaking, opportunistic feeders. They can eat whatever. So they can eat meat, they can eat plants, they can eat insects. So they're not tied to one type of food, first of all. Second of all, they're generally smaller. So you don't need as many calories to stay alive versus like a giant sauropod like Brachiosaurus needs to eat a lot more to survive. And lastly, if you can fly, you can cover distance easily. So I think the combination of not needing a ton of calories, being able to eat whatever they could find, and actually being able to travel distance to find that scarce food is probably, in my mind, what allowed them to survive. Alyssa, would you agree with that take?
Yeah, I think the fact that birds are generalists and birds are small absolutely help them out, of course. Something else to think about is the incubation time of their eggs is very short.
Oh, yes.
So they wouldn't have been tied to sort of that longer incubation time that larger dinosaurs might have been stuck with, which helps with their ability to disperse as they migrate seasonally and things like that. Something else to keep in mind, though, is that there are lots of birds that didn't make it across the boundary as well. So not all birds that were around at the end of the Mesozoic survived into the Cenozoic. We have lots of examples of late Cretaceous birds like the Hesperonythiforms that did not survive that extinction event. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on with that extinction for sure.
So I learned from Christina literally just last week that is a mass extinction, not just an extinction. It's a mass extinction because 75% of all species of animal on Earth went extinct. And you have to hit apparently 75% to make it a mass extinction, not just an extinction event. 75%.
It is one of the big 5.
Big old extinction event.
All right, Christina, I know we got a ton of questions. I'm gonna turn it over to you. Hit us.
Oh, do we have questions? Let's start with Danelle's question, who asked, do you know anything about the Stegosaurus, like in your background, second brain posterior myth? That it's more likely, Danelle knows some things, a glycogen body that birds today have, but they still don't know what it is or does. Are there any new theories?
Butt brains, let's go.
Yeah, so that's a pretty good synopsis of what's been hypothesized. One of the hypotheses has been brought up. That's something that we have to remember isn't going to preserve very well. That the glycogen body would be entirely soft tissue. And so we're going off of what's left of the bone structure that would have been around it. And so it is just a hypothesis at this point. And so that's something that we're not able to sort of make final decisions one way or the other on.
We have a kiddo who wants to know, how many teeth did dinos typically have?
That's a great question. I don't actually know how many teeth all of the different dinosaurs had, but I think the answer is a lot.
Depends on the type. This is a cast of a tooth from a T-Rex, which is obviously enormous. I call them murder bananas.
Yeah, that's terrifying.
Serrated murder bananas. Ilana wants to know, why is the T-Rex considered the king of dinos when the Spinosaurus is bigger?
You know, I think that's probably because Tyrannosaurus just got more famous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I maybe it shouldn't be known as the king of dinosaurs, other than the fact that Rex means, you know, is king in Latin. It might be an unfair name. Maybe we should just start talking about Spinosaurus as the emperor of dinosaurs. To be more fair.
I like that.
No reason why we can't.
Yeah.
I'm here for the queen of dinos, but we'll see.
Absolutely, let's do that.
Okay, we're coming up on the end here, so we can only take a couple more questions. They are all fabulous. Inspired by your fieldwork pictures, why does Utah / the Midwest seem to be the hub of excavation activity? Is it relative to human activity, large areas that seem relatively undisturbed, or is it just that there are more fossils in those areas?
So it has to do with the rocks in those areas being the right age and being exposed at the surface in places where you can find the bones. So if you go out to Utah or Wyoming or Montana, parts of Colorado, any of these places, you see this sort of typical badland topography where you've just got tons and tons and tons of rocks exposed because it's a very desert environment. Things aren't covered up with lots of plants. And it's very easy to see the rocks and then see the fossils in them. And those rocks happen to be in lots of places the right age and the right type of rock to preserve dinosaurs.
Yeah,
absolutely. And related to your work outside the museum, are there circumstances in which fossils might not be preserved if they're found on a construction site?
So that's exactly why we have mitigation paleontology. It's to make sure that fossils are preserved. And if you have monitors on site who are, you know, prepared to step in and salvage those fossils as they're found, then it's really the best of both worlds, because science gets to be advanced, the fossils are protected, we can learn what we can from them, and at the same time, the construction can proceed in a timely fashion. And so it really keeps both end goals moving along very nicely.
All right, thank you all for your questions. We are not able to get to all of them. You're clearly people who know a lot of things about dinos. So thank you for your curiosity and sending us all of your questions.
Yeah, I've learned a lot already. My last question before we bounce, Alyssa, I have to ask you, as a legit actual doctor of paleontology who studies dinosaurs, other than your study group, what is your favorite dinosaur and why?
Stegosaurus is absolutely my favorite dinosaur. It has been ever since I was a little kid.
Nice.
And I thought they were always fascinating because they're huge, right? They're enormous dinosaurs. And yet they have these teeny tiny little heads.
Yeah.
And they couldn't have been that smart, right? They must have been really, really dumb. And maybe they would have made good pets. You don't really want a velociraptor for a pet, right? They're too smart. But a Stegosaurus, I can see myself riding around on a Stegosaurus, no problem.
Stegosaurus is great. I love me. That's a great answer. I love Stegosaurus. I love you. This has been amazing. You guys, thank you so much. First of all, I want to let you know, as we draw to a close, starting at 8 p.m. is the KCRW DJ Novena Carmel in the DJ Lounge. That was a bug at the Natural History Museum YouTube channel. So head over once you've grabbed a drink over to the Natural History Museum YouTube channel for that DJ set. But for now, you guys, I don't care if you're like a Hesperornis diving for fish, or you're out in your backyard in LA planting flowers, or you want to learn more about dinosaurs. Never stop digging. Thank you so much, Dr. Alyssa Bell, for joining us, teaching us all about Hesperornis, as well as your favorite dinosaur, Stegosaurus. Christina, thank you. Thanks to Natural History Museum. You guys head over to the DJ set, grab a drink, do so. I'll see you guys over there. Have a good one, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Alyssa.
Thank you.